The widow's black dress hung on her frame like a funeral shroud. And as Zelda Ramsey walked through the dusty streets of Verdi, Nevada in the scorching August heat of 1878, she could feel every pair of eyes burning into her back with judgment sharper than any blade. 3 months had passed since they buried Thomas beneath the hard desert earth. 3 months since the mining accident that crushed him and 2 other men beneath a collapsing shaft. And still, the whispers followed her like hungry vultures circling something that refused to die. She kept her gaze fixed straight ahead as she made her way toward the general store, her worn boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The sun blazed overhead, merciless and white-hot, turning the packed dirt street into something that shimmered with heat waves. Verdi was a small railroad town, squeezed between the Sierra Nevada mountains and the desert, where the Transcontinental Railroad brought both prosperity and trouble in equal measure. The Truckee River ran nearby, a lifeline in this harsh landscape, but even its waters could not wash away the cruelty of small-town gossip. "Should have thrown herself on his coffin," she heard Mrs. Henderson say to Mrs. Park as she passed by the millinery shop. The words were not even whispered, spoken loud enough to ensure Zelda heard every syllable. No children, no family, nothing keeping her here. What kind of wife continues on when her husband is cold in the ground? Zelda's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging crescents into her palms, but she did not slow her pace. She was 23 years old, had been married for only 18 months before Thomas died, and apparently that was enough time for the town to decide she should have loved him enough to follow him into death. Never mind that their marriage had been one of convenience more than passion, arranged by her father to secure her future before he himself had succumbed to pneumonia. Never mind that Thomas had been kind but distant, more interested in his mining ventures and card games than in building a life with her. The general store bell chimed as she pushed through the door, and the conversation inside died immediately. Mr. Calloway behind the counter cleared his throat uncomfortably, while the 3 women browsing the dry goods turned to stare with undisguised hostility. "Mrs. Ramsey," Mr. Calloway said, his tone formal and cold. "What can I do for you?" "I need flour, coffee, and beans," Zelda said, keeping her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "And I will need credit until the end of the month." His expression hardened. "I am afraid I cannot extend you any more credit. You already owe $12 from last month. I am waiting for Thomas's final wages from the mining company. They said it would take time to process, but I should have it within the week." "That is what you said last week, Mrs. Ramsey." He crossed his arms over his chest, his sympathy clearly exhausted. "I have a business to run. Perhaps you should consider returning to wherever you came from. You have no family here, no real ties. There is nothing for you in Verdi." The words hit her like physical blows, each one designed to push her toward the door and out of their town entirely. She opened her mouth to respond, to defend herself, to explain that she had nowhere else to go and no money for passage even if she did, when the door swung open behind her with enough force to make the bell clang violently. "That is a hell of a way to treat a paying customer, Calloway." The voice was deep and rough, carrying the weight of authority and barely restrained anger. Zelda turned to find herself face to face with a man she had seen around town but never spoken to, one of the cowboys who worked the ranches in the surrounding territory. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. Dust covered his clothes, and a worn hat sat, pushed back on his head, revealing a sun-browned face with sharp features and a jaw set in displeasure. "This is not your concern, Everett," Mr. Calloway said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Seems like it is, seeing as I just walked in on you refusing service to a lady who has done nothing wrong except survive when her husband did not." The cowboy, Everett, moved to stand beside Zelda, and she could feel the heat radiating from him after his ride in from wherever he had been working. "Put her order on my account. Flour, coffee, beans, and whatever else she needs." "Now wait just a minute," Zelda started, her pride flaring hot in her chest. She did not need charity from a stranger, did not want to be indebted to anyone in this God-forsaken town. "No, you wait," he said, but when he looked at her, his expression softened considerably. "Please, let me do this." There was something in his eyes, something genuine and kind that made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She had not seen kindness in so long that she had almost forgotten what it looked like. She nodded once, unable to trust her voice, and watched as he stepped up to the counter and began negotiating with Mr. Calloway. His presence transforming the space like a lightning strike transforms the air before a storm. Within minutes, the supplies were wrapped and packed, and the cowboy was carrying them out into the brutal sunlight as if they weighed nothing at all. Zelda followed, her mind reeling from what had just transpired, trying to understand why a stranger would intervene on her behalf when the rest of the town wanted her gone. "Where do you live?" he asked, adjusting the packages in his arms. "The boarding house on 3rd Street," she said. "But you do not have to carry them. I can manage." "I know you can," he said simply, "but I am already carrying them, so you might as well let me finish the job." They walked in silence through the oppressive heat, past the railroad depot where trains occasionally screamed through town, past the saloons that never seemed to close, past the small whitewashed church where Zelda had not set foot since Thomas's funeral. The boarding house was a narrow 2-story building that leaned slightly to the left, run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, who asked few questions as long as the rent was paid. "2nd floor, last room on the right," Zelda said when they entered the dim interior, grateful for the shade even if the air inside was stifling and still. He climbed the stairs behind her, his boots heavy on the worn wood, and waited while she unlocked her door. The room was small and sparse, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand, a small table with one chair, and a trunk that held everything she owned in the world. A single window looked out over the street, covered with a thin curtain that did little to block the light or the heat. He set the packages on the table carefully, then turned to face her in the cramped space. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the way his hands were rough and calloused from hard work. He smelled like leather and horse and the open range, wild and free in a way that made her suddenly aware of how trapped she had been feeling. "Thank you," she said, and hated how her voice cracked on the words. "You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said. "My name is Ryder Everett. I work at the Double Bar Ranch about 5 miles west of here, and I know what it is like to have a whole town decide you are not worth their time or trouble." "Zelda Ramsey," she said, though he clearly already knew her name. "And why would they think that about you?" His smile was bitter and brief. "Because I came here from Texas with nothing but the clothes on my back and a reputation for trouble that may or may not have been deserved. Because I do not bow and scrape to the men who think they own this territory. Because I choose my own path and do not apologize for it." He paused, his gaze intense on hers. "And because I think you were meant to live, Mrs. Ramsey, despite what this town says. You were meant to live and do something more than mourn a man you barely knew." The words struck her like a match to kindling, igniting something inside her chest that she had thought long dead. Anger, yes, but also something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. You do not know anything about my marriage. You are right, I do not, but I have eyes. I saw you with him in town a few times before he died. I saw the way he ignored you, the way you looked like a ghost even then. And I have seen you these past months, watched you refuse to break even when everyone wanted you to. That takes strength, Mrs. Ramsey. That takes a will to live that should not be dismissed or scorned. Tears burned hot behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Why are you doing this? Why do you care what happens to me? He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if memorizing every detail. Because the first time I saw you, about a year ago, you were standing outside the church on a Sunday morning. The sun was hitting your hair and you were smiling at something, really smiling, and I thought you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. And then I saw that smile fade when your husband came out and barely acknowledged you, and I thought it was the worst crime I had ever witnessed, making someone that full of light dim themselves down to nothing. Her breath caught in her throat. She had no memory of that day, could not recall what might have made her smile, but the idea that someone had noticed her, really seen her even then, made her feel more real than she had in months. I am still married in the eyes of God, she whispered, though even as she said it, she knew it was a defense against something that terrified her more than all the judgment in Verdi combined. You are a widow, he corrected gently, and there is no sin in living, no matter what the gossips say. You are allowed to want things, to build a new life, to be happy. I do not even know what that would look like anymore. Then maybe we can figure it out together. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and rough, his grip careful as if she were something precious and fragile. Let me call on you properly. Let me show you that not everyone in this territory is small-minded and cruel. You do not have to marry me or promise me anything. Just let me prove that you deserve better than this. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was too fast, too much, too dangerous. But her heart, that treacherous organ she had tried so hard to keep locked away, was hammering yes, yes, yes with every beat. The town will talk. Let them talk. I stopped listening to them a long time ago. His thumb brushed across her knuckles in a gesture so tender it made her ache. What do you say, Zelda Ramsey? Will you let me prove them all wrong? She looked into his whiskey-colored eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and a carefully banked fire that promised warmth instead of destruction. She thought about the long, empty days stretching before her in this hostile town, thought about the grinding poverty and loneliness that was slowly killing her from the inside out. And she thought about that smile he claimed to have seen, that version of herself she had lost somewhere along the way. Yes, she said, and the word felt like stepping off a cliff and learning to fly. Yes, you can call on me. His answering smile transformed his entire face, lighting him up from within in a way that made her stomach flip. Tomorrow evening, then. I will bring dinner so you do not have to cook in this heat, and we can talk like civilized people getting to know each other. I would like that. He squeezed her hand once more before releasing it and heading for the door. In the doorway, he paused and looked back at her. For what it is worth, I am glad you are alive, Zelda. This world would be a darker place without you in it. Then he was gone, his boots echoing down the stairs and out into the street, leaving her standing in her small room with her heart pounding and her hands shaking, and something that felt dangerously like joy bubbling up inside her chest. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Zelda tried to occupy herself with mending her limited wardrobe, with washing her hair in the lukewarm water from the basin, with anything that would make the hours pass faster. She felt like a girl again, nervous and excited in equal measure, and tried not to examine too closely what that meant. She barely knew Ryder Everett. He could be anyone, could want anything from her. But something in her gut told her to trust him, to take this chance that had been offered like water in the desert. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that took her breath away, she heard his boots on the stairs. She opened the door before he could knock, and found him standing there with a basket in his hands and his hat in his hand, his hair damp as if he had dunked his whole head in the river to clean up. "Evening," he said, and she could see the nervousness in the set of his shoulders, the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot. It made him more real, more human, and she found herself relaxing slightly. "Come in," she said, stepping back to let him enter her small sanctuary. He set the basket on the table and began unpacking it, revealing fried chicken that was still warm, fresh bread, butter, sliced tomatoes, and a small jar of peach preserves that must have cost him a day's wages. Her eyes widened at the spread. "This is too much." "Nothing is too much," he said firmly. "You have been living on nothing but beans and coffee for weeks. Let me do this." They sat across from each other at her small table, their knees almost touching in the cramped space, and began to eat. For a while neither spoke, the silence comfortable as they satisfied their hunger. But eventually, Ryder set down his chicken leg and looked at her seriously. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "Not about your husband or what the town thinks. Tell me about who you were before all of this." So she did. She told him about growing up in Sacramento, about her mother who had died when Zelda was 12, about her father who had been a clerk with dreams bigger than his station. She told him about learning to read from her mother's precious books, about her love of music even though she could not afford lessons, about the small freedom she had cherished before duty and obligation had closed in around her. And as she talked, she watched his face, saw the way he listened with his whole body, leaning forward as if every word mattered. "Your turn," she said when she finally ran out of words. "Tell me about Texas and trouble and how you ended up here." His expression darkened slightly, but he did not look away. "My father was a ranch hand, my mother a Mexican woman who worked as a cook. They were not married, and in Texas, that made me less than nothing in most people's eyes. I grew up working horses, fighting anyone who insulted my mother, and dreaming about a place where none of that mattered. When I was 19, I got into a fight with the ranch owner's son after he tried to force himself on one of the kitchen girls. I beat him bloody, and his father said he would have me hanged for it, so I ran. Where is your mother now? Dead 5 years past. Fever took her fast." The pain in his voice was still fresh despite the years. "I sent money when I could, but I could not go back, could not risk it. And after she died, there was nothing left for me there anyway." Zelda reached across the table and took his hand, the gesture feeling natural despite how little time they had known each other. "I am sorry. That must have been impossibly hard. It taught me that the world is not fair, and that the only person you can truly rely on is yourself. But it also taught me to recognize strength when I see it. And you, Zelda Ramsey, are one of the strongest people I have ever met. I do not feel strong. I feel like I am barely holding on. That is exactly what strength is. Not some big dramatic gesture, but the quiet decision to keep going even when everything is telling you to give up." His fingers laced through hers, warm and solid and real. "You could have left. Could have thrown yourself on everyone's mercy and let them ship you back to Sacramento or wherever. But you stayed. You fought for your right to be here, to make a life on your own terms. That is extraordinary." She had never thought of it that way, had only seen her stubbornness as a flaw that kept her trapped in this hostile place. But hearing him reframe it as strength made something shift inside her, made her sit up a little straighter and meet his gaze with less fear and more determination. They talked until the sky outside her window turned from purple to deep blue to black, until the stars emerged in their thousands across the desert sky. They talked about everything and nothing, about dreams they had abandoned and hopes they barely dared to voice. And when he finally stood to leave, when he paused at her door and looked at her with heat in his eyes that made her blood sing, she knew that everything had changed. "Can I see you again tomorrow?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and this time the word came easier, felt less like jumping and more like choosing. "Yes, I would like that very much." He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles that sent shivers racing up her arm despite the lingering heat of the day. "Sleep well, Zelda." "You too, Ryder." The next few weeks fell into a pattern that felt like the first real routine Zelda had known since Thomas died. Ryder would arrive every evening after his work at the ranch was done, sometimes bringing food, sometimes just bringing himself and his stories and his careful attention. They would sit in her small room or, when the heat became too oppressive, walk along the Truckee River as the sun set, talking about everything under the vast Nevada sky. The town, predictably, had opinions. The whispers that had called for her death now shifted to calling her shameful, indecent, a woman who clearly had never loved her husband if she could move on so quickly. Zelda found that she cared less and less what they thought. Ryder had awakened something in her that had been dormant for so long she had forgotten it existed. The belief that she deserved happiness, that her life had value beyond what others determined it should be. On a particularly hot afternoon in late September, when the heat showed no signs of breaking despite the changing season, Zelda ventured out to the river alone to wash her clothing. She found a spot away from the main paths, where the cottonwood trees provided some shade and the water ran clear and cool over smooth stones. She was scrubbing her second dress when she heard voices approaching, sharp with malice. "Well, look what we have here. The merry widow doing her laundry." Zelda looked up to find 3 women from town standing on the path above her. Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Park, and Miss Judith Blackwell, the daughter of the bank owner who had always treated Zelda like something unpleasant she had stepped in. Their faces were twisted with self-righteous anger, and Zelda felt her stomach clench with apprehension. "Good afternoon, ladies," she said, keeping her voice level as she stood, water dripping from her hands. "There is nothing good about it," Mrs. Henderson said. "We have come to tell you that your disgraceful behavior has gone on long enough. Carrying on with that cowboy while your husband has barely been dead 3 months. Have you no shame?" "My husband has been dead 4 months," Zelda corrected, her own anger beginning to rise. "And I am not carrying on with anyone. Ryder has been kind enough to keep me company and ensure I do not starve. That is all." "That is not all, and everyone knows it," Miss Blackwell said, her voice dripping with disdain. "We have seen the way you look at him, the way you walk with him bold as brass for all the town to see. You are an embarrassment and a disgrace, and we will not stand for it any longer. What exactly do you plan to do about it?" Zelda asked, and was pleased to hear her voice remained steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "We are going to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of woman you are," Mrs. Park said. "We will speak to Mrs. Chen about evicting you from the boarding house. We will speak to the mining company about withholding your husband's final wages. We will make certain that you have no choice but to leave Verdi, because we do not want your kind here." Something inside Zelda snapped, all the weeks of enduring their judgment and cruelty finally reaching a breaking point. "My kind? What kind is that exactly? A woman who refuses to die just because you think she should. A woman who has the audacity to want to live and maybe even find some small measure of happiness after losing everything. What exactly is so threatening about that? You are making a mockery of marriage, of widowhood, of everything decent women hold sacred, Mrs. Henderson insisted. No, Zelda said, and her voice was strong now, ringing clear across the river. I am simply refusing to live my life according to your narrow, cruel expectations. My marriage to Thomas was arranged. We barely knew each other. I mourned him as much as I was able, but I will not spend the rest of my life dressed in black and weeping for a man who never truly saw me. I am 23 years old, and I am going to live. And if that offends you, if that threatens your sense of how the world should work, then that is your problem, not mine. Miss Blackwell's face had gone red with fury. You will regret this. We will make sure of it. Do your worst, Zelda said, and was startled to realize she meant it. I have survived worse than your gossip and schemes. I will survive this too. The three women exchanged glances, clearly not having expected this level of resistance, then turned and stalked away, their skirts swishing with indignation. Zelda stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding, her hands shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline. Then she sank down onto the riverbank and let out a shaky laugh that might have contained a few tears. She did not tell Ryder about the confrontation when he arrived that evening, not wanting to burden him with more of the town's ugliness. But he took one look at her face and knew something had happened. What is wrong? He asked immediately, setting down the basket of food and coming to sit beside her on the bed. Nothing, she lied, but he gave her a look that said he knew better. Zelda. So she told him, the words spilling out in a rush about the three women and their threats and her own defiant response. By the time she finished, she was shaking again, and Ryder had pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest as if he could shield her from the world through sheer force of will. I am so tired of fighting, she whispered against his shirt. I am so tired of having to justify my existence to people who have already decided I am worthless. Then stop fighting, he said, and she pulled back to look at him in confusion. What? Stop fighting them. Stop caring what they think. Stop living in this town that hates you and come with me. His hands cupped her face, his eyes intense on hers. The Double Bar Ranch needs a cook. The owner, Mr. Sullivan, is a good man who does not care about gossip or scandal. He would hire you in an instant if I asked him. You could leave the boarding house, leave these terrible people behind, and start fresh. Ryder, I cannot just run away. Why not? What is keeping you here? Your husband is dead, you have no family in Verdi, and the town wants you gone. So leave, but on your terms, not theirs. Come work at the ranch. Build a new life. Let me be part of that life if you want me. If I want you, she laughed, the sound watery but genuine. I think about you constantly. I wait all day for the moment you will walk through that door. I have never felt this way about anyone, not even close, and it terrifies me. Why does it terrify you? Because what if you wake up one day and realize I am not worth all this trouble? What if you decide the town is right and I am too much work, too much scandal, too much everything? His hands tightened on her face, gentle but firm. Listen to me very carefully, Zelda Ramsey. You are not too much of anything. You are brave and strong and beautiful and kind, and I am falling in love with you. Have been since that day I saw you smile outside the church. And nothing this town says or does is going to change that. Her breath caught, her heart stuttering in her chest. You love me. I love you, he confirmed, and the simple certainty in his voice made her want to weep. I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a few weeks. But when you have spent your whole life feeling alone, you recognize the person who makes you feel found. And you make me feel found, Zelda. You make me feel like all the wandering and running and searching finally brought me somewhere worth being. She kissed him then, unable to help herself. rising up on her knees and pressing her lips to his with all the desperate longing she had been trying to suppress. He made a sound low in his throat and pulled her closer, his arms banding around her waist as he kissed her back with a hunger that matched her own. It was nothing like the chaste, dutiful kisses Thomas had given her. This was fire and need and the recognition of two souls who had been searching for exactly this. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his and whispered, "I love you too. I did not think I could, did not think I was capable of it. But I love you, Ryder Everett, and yes, I will come to the ranch. I will start over. I will build a life with you if you truly want me." "I truly want you," he said, and kissed her again, softer this time but no less intense. "I will talk to Mr. Sullivan tomorrow. We will get you set up in the bunkhouse cook's quarters, and you can start as soon as you are ready." "I am ready now," she said. "I have been ready for months. I just did not know what I was ready for until you showed up." They made plans late into the night, talking about logistics and practicalities and all the small details that would need to be handled. Ryder would speak to Mr. Sullivan, would ensure she had a place at the ranch and a fair wage. Zelda would collect her husband's final wages from the mining company if they had truly been processed, would settle her account with Mrs. Chen, would pack her few belongings and leave Verdi without looking back. 2 days later, she stood in the mining company office, facing the clerk who had been avoiding her for months. "I have come for Thomas's final wages," she said, her voice hard as stone, "and I will not leave until I receive them." The clerk, a nervous man named Mr. Peters who had always been kind to her before Thomas died, looked acutely uncomfortable. "Mrs. Ramsey, I am afraid the company has decided to withhold those wages." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that your behavior since your husband's death has been, well, unseemly. The company does not wish to be associated with someone of questionable moral character." She had expected this, had been warned by Ryder that the women would follow through on their threats, but hearing it still made her see red. "My husband died working in your mine. He is owed those wages, and by extension, so am I. If you do not hand them over immediately, I will contact a lawyer in Reno and sue the company for every cent. You do not have money for a lawyer. Then I will go to the newspaper. I am sure they would be very interested to hear about a mining company that refuses to pay a dead man's wages to his widow because the local gossips do not approve of her. I imagine that would make for quite a story, do you not think?" Mr. Peters paled. The last thing the mining company needed was bad publicity when they were already struggling with safety concerns and union rumblings. "Wait here," he said, and disappeared into the back office. He returned 10 minutes later with a small pouch of coins and a receipt. $32, he said stiffly. "Sign here to acknowledge receipt." She signed with a flourish, took the money and walked out with her head high. It was not much, barely enough to keep her fed for a couple of months, but it was hers and she had fought for it and won. That felt like victory enough. Mrs. Chen, surprisingly, was understanding about her departure from the boarding house. "I always liked you," the older woman said as Zelda paid her final week's rent and prepared to leave. "You reminded me of myself when I first came to this country. Alone and determined to survive no matter what, I hope you find happiness with your cowboy." "Thank you," Zelda said, genuinely touched. "That means more than you know." "One more thing," Mrs. Chen said, reaching under the counter and pulling out a small wrapped package. "A gift for your new life." Inside was a beautiful blue scarf, silk and delicate and clearly expensive. Zelda looked up at Mrs. Chen with tears in her eyes. "I cannot accept this." "You can and you will. You have worn nothing but black for 4 months. It is time for some color, do you not think?" Zelda left the boarding house with her trunk, her precious books, and the blue scarf wrapped around her shoulders despite the heat, feeling like she was shedding an old skin and emerging new. Ryder was waiting for her with a wagon borrowed from the ranch, and his face when he saw that splash of blue against her black dress, was worth every bit of struggle it had taken to get here. "You look beautiful," he said, helping her up onto the seat beside him. "I look like a mess," she said, but she was smiling. "You look free," he corrected, and snapped the reins to get the horses moving. The Double Bar Ranch sat in a valley west of Verdi, nestled against the foothills with the Truckee River running through the property. It was larger than Zelda had expected, with several barns, a main house, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, and a separate small cabin that served as the cook's quarters. Mr. Sullivan, a grizzled man in his 60s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, met them as they pulled up. "So you are the widow," he said, looking Zelda up and down appraisingly. "Ryder here says you are a good cook and a hard worker. That true?" "I am a decent cook and I am not afraid of work," Zelda said honestly. "And I am grateful for the opportunity. Do not be grateful yet. You will be cooking 3 meals a day for 15 men with appetites like horses. It is hard work and the hours are long, but the pay is fair and nobody here cares what the town gossips say. We judge people by their actions, not their past. That sit well with you." "That sits perfectly with me, Mr. Sullivan." "Then welcome to the Double Bar. Ryder will show you to your quarters and introduce you to the other hands. Supper is at 6 sharp. Think you can manage that for tonight?" "I can manage that," she said, and felt a thrill of purpose run through her. This was it. This was her fresh start. The cook's cabin was small but infinitely better than her room at the boarding house. It had a real wood stove, a table with 4 chairs, a bed that did not sag in the middle, and shelves for her books and belongings. There was even a small porch where she could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set over the mountains. Ryder helped her unpack, his presence solid and comforting as she began to make the space her own. "What do you think?" he asked when everything was settled. "I think it is perfect," she said honestly. "I think I can be happy here. I know you can be." He pulled her into his arms and she went willingly, resting her head against his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. "And I am right next door in the bunkhouse, so if you need anything, I am close." She looked up at him, at this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to voice, and felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you for everything. For seeing me when I was invisible. For believing in me when I could not believe in myself. For giving me a reason to keep living. You are the one who chose to live," he said, tilting her chin up so she met his eyes. "I just reminded you that you could. Everything else, all your strength and courage and determination, that was all you." He kissed her then, slow and deep, and she felt herself melting into him, into this new life, into the possibility of happiness she had thought forever beyond her reach. When he finally pulled away, both of them were flushed and breathing hard. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "Let you get settled and start on supper, but I will see you at dinner and every day after that for as long as you will have me." "Forever then," she said, and watched his face light up with joy. The first few weeks at the ranch were exhausting but exhilarating. Zelda threw herself into the work with single-minded determination, learning the preferences of each ranch hand, perfecting her biscuits and gravy, experimenting with the limited ingredients available to create meals that were both filling and interesting. The men were initially wary of her, clearly having heard the town gossip, but her cooking and her refusal to tolerate any nonsense won them over quickly. Ryder ate every meal with a smile on his face, watching her move around the cookhouse with pride evident in every line of his body. At night, After the dishes were done and the men had returned to the bunkhouse, he would walk her back to her cabin and they would sit on the porch, talking and laughing and stealing kisses under the vast canopy of stars. One evening in early November, as the weather finally began to cool and the first hints of winter crept into the air, Ryder arrived at her cabin with his hat in his hands and a nervous energy that immediately put her on alert. "What is wrong?" she asked, pulling him inside. "Nothing is wrong," he said, but he was pacing her small space like a caged animal. "Everything is right, actually, which is what makes this so terrifying. Ryder, you are not making any sense." He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression so intense it took her breath away. "I know we have only known each other a few months. I know that by any measure, this is too fast and too much. But I also know that I have never been more certain of anything in my entire life than I am of this, of us, of what I am about to ask you." Her heart started to pound, hope and fear warring in her chest. "What are you asking?" He dropped to one knee, pulling a simple gold band from his pocket. "Marry me, Zelda. Not because you need protection or security or someone to take care of you, but because I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. Because you make me want to be better, to do better, to build something lasting and real. Because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Marry me, and let me spend the rest of my days proving that you were meant to live, and I was meant to love you." Tears were streaming down her face, hot and fast, but for once they were tears of joy instead of grief. "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet and throwing her arms around his neck. "Yes, yes, yes. I will marry you, Ryder Everett. I will build a life with you. I will love you for as long as I draw breath." He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, and kissed her with such tenderness and passion that she felt herself falling apart and coming back together all at once. This was what love was supposed to feel like, she realized. Not duty or obligation or quiet resignation, but this fierce, bright thing that made everything else fade into insignificance. They were married 3 weeks later in Reno, away from the judgment and gossip of Verdi, with Mr. Sullivan and 2 of the ranch hands serving as witnesses. Zelda wore a new dress in deep green that Ryder had insisted on buying her, and she carried a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers that he had picked himself that morning. The ceremony was simple and quick, but when the justice of the peace pronounced them husband and wife, when Ryder kissed her with tears in his eyes and joy on his face, she felt like the richest woman in the world. Mr. Sullivan gave them 3 days off for a honeymoon, which they spent in a small hotel in Reno, learning each other's bodies with the same intensity they had already learned each other's hearts. Ryder was gentle and patient, understanding that her previous experience with intimacy had been perfunctory at best, and he took his time showing her all the ways love could be expressed through touch and heat and breathless pleasure. By the time they returned to the ranch, Zelda felt utterly transformed, as if she had been reborn into a person who was finally allowed to want things, to feel things, to live without apology. The months that followed were the happiest of her life. She settled into her role at the ranch with increasing confidence, and Ryder proved to be everything she had hoped for in a partner. He was steady and hardworking, but also playful and affectionate, stealing kisses when he thought no one was looking, leaving her small gifts of pretty stones or interesting feathers he found on the range, telling her stories that made her laugh until her sides ached. In late spring of 1879, she realized her monthly bleeding had not come. She waited another month to be certain, then another, before finally telling Ryder one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink. "I am with child," she said quietly, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. He went very still beside her, and for one terrifying moment she thought he was going to react badly. Then he let out a whoop of joy that probably carried all the way to Verdi, scooped her up in his arms, and spun her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "We are going to have a baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We are going to be a family." "We are already a family," she corrected, but she was crying happy tears again. "But yes, we are going to have a baby." He set her down carefully, as if she had suddenly become made of glass, and dropped to his knees in front of her. He pressed his face against her stomach, his hand spanning her waist, and she ran her fingers through his hair and felt a contentment so deep it was almost frightening. "I love you," he whispered against her dress. "Both of you, so much." The pregnancy was not easy. The summer heat was brutal, and Zelda struggled with nausea and exhaustion that made her daily work a challenge. But Ryder was attentive and supportive, taking over some of her duties when she was too tired to manage, bringing her water and cool cloths when the heat became too much, holding her when she cried from hormones and fear, and the overwhelming magnitude of what they were creating together. In January of 1880, during a rare winter storm that blanketed the valley in snow, Zelda went into labor. Ryder rode through the blizzard to fetch the midwife from a neighboring ranch, his face white with terror, and then held Zelda's hand through 18 hours of pain and struggle as their child fought to be born. When the baby finally arrived, red-faced and screaming with fury at the cold world it had entered, Zelda looked down at her son and felt her heart expand beyond what she had thought possible. "He is perfect," she whispered, exhausted but elated. "He is perfect because he is yours," Ryder said, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son for the first time. What should we name him? She had thought about this for months, had gone through 100 options, but in that moment only one name felt right. Daniel. "It means God is my judge, and I think that is fitting, do you not? Given that we chose to live and love despite what everyone else thought we should do." "Daniel Everett," Ryder said, testing the name. I like it very much." They brought Daniel home 2 days later, wrapped in blankets against the cold, and began the bewildering adventure of parenthood. The ranch hands were surprisingly helpful, offering advice and assistance and willing babysitters when Zelda needed to focus on cooking. Mr. Sullivan built a cradle with his own hands and presented it to them gruffly, saying only that every child deserved a good place to sleep. The years that followed brought more children. A daughter named Sarah in 1882, another son named Matthew in 1884, and finally twin girls, Rose and Ruth, in 1886. Their small cabin had to be expanded twice to accommodate their growing family, and Zelda eventually had to hire help with the cooking, as managing 5 children and feeding 15 ranch hands became impossible for one person. Through it all, Ryder remained her constant, her partner in every sense of the word. He was patient with the children, teaching them to ride and rope and navigate the harsh beauty of the Nevada landscape. He was loving with Zelda, still stealing kisses and leaving her small gifts, still looking at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, even when she was covered in flour and baby spit and exhausted beyond measure. Occasionally, news would filter out from Verdi. Mrs. Henderson had died. The bank had failed, ruining the Blackwell family and forcing them to move east. The mining company had closed after a series of accidents made it impossible to insure. Zelda listened to these updates with a distant sort of interest, but no real emotion. That life, that version of herself who had been so desperate and alone and convinced she had no future, felt like a stranger now. On a warm evening in June of 1890, As Zelda sat on the expanded porch watching her children play in the yard and feeling the familiar weight of another baby growing inside her, Ryder came to sit beside her and took her hand. "You remember what I said to you, the first day we really talked?" he asked. "You said a lot of things that day," she said, smiling at him. "Which part are you referring to?" "I said you were meant to live. That despite what the town said, you were meant to be alive and do something more than mourn." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, the gesture as sweet now as it had been 12 years ago. "I just wanted you to know that I was right. Look at what you have built. Look at this family, this life, this legacy. You were absolutely meant to live, Zelda Everett. And I am so grateful that I got to be part of your living." She looked at her children, at her husband, at the ranch that had become home, and felt tears prick her eyes yet again. But these were good tears, grateful tears, the tears of someone who had been given a second chance and seized it with both hands. "I was meant to live," she agreed softly. "And you were meant to love me. And together, we were meant to build something beautiful from all that ugliness and grief. Thank you for seeing that when I could not. Thank you for being brave enough to believe me," he said, and pulled her close. As the sun set over the Sierra Nevada mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, as her children's laughter rang out across the valley, and her husband's arms held her safe, Zelda thought about that broken, desperate woman who had walked through Verdi 12 years ago, convinced she had nothing left to live for. She thought about the town that had wanted her dead, and the cowboy who had insisted she was meant to live, and she sent up a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever force had brought them together, had given her this impossible, beautiful life. The baby was born in November. Another healthy son they named Thomas after her first husband, a gesture of peace toward the past that no longer had the power to hurt her. Ryder held him with practiced ease, his sixth child but still as miraculous as the first, and looked at Zelda with so much love it still took her breath away after all these years. "6 children," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "We have 6 beautiful children and a life I never dared to dream of. How did we get so lucky?" "It was not luck," she said. "It was choice. We chose each other. We chose to build something good from something broken. We chose love over fear, hope over despair, life over death." "Best choice I ever made," he said, and leaned over the baby to kiss her. The children grew as children do. Daniel inherited his father's way with horses and his mother's fierce determination. Sarah had Zelda's love of books and learning, eventually becoming a teacher in Reno. Matthew was quiet and thoughtful, content to work the ranch alongside his father. The twins, Rose and Ruth, were inseparable troublemakers who kept everyone on their toes. And little Thomas grew into a sweet-natured boy who loved music, and became quite skilled with the fiddle one of the ranch hands taught him to play. In 1895, when Zelda was 40 years old and Ryder was 42, Mr. Sullivan approached them with an offer that took their breath away. He was getting old, he said, and had no children of his own to leave the ranch to. He wanted to sell them the double bar at a price they could actually afford, payments spread over years, so that they would always have security and a legacy to pass on to their children. They accepted with tears and gratitude, and became the owners of the ranch that had given them both a second chance at life. Over the years, they improved and expanded it, adding more cattle, better horses, newer buildings. Daniel and Matthew eventually took over most of the daily operations, allowing Ryder and Zelda to slow down slightly, though neither ever fully retired. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1899, Ryder surprised Zelda with a trip back to Verdi. She had not been to the town in over 2 decades, had no desire to revisit the place of so much pain, but he insisted there was something he needed to show her. They rode in on a crisp autumn day, the town looking both familiar and strange after so much time. Many of the businesses had changed hands or closed entirely. The railroad was busier than ever, but the mining operations had never recovered. Few people recognized them, and those who did stared with confusion and barely concealed hostility. Ryder took her to the cemetery on the edge of town, to the plot where Thomas Ramsey was buried. The grave was well maintained, the stone simple but clean, and Zelda felt a pang of old grief mixed with something like fondness for the man she had barely known. "I wanted you to be able to say goodbye properly," Ryder said quietly, his hand warm in hers. "You never got the chance before, not really. You were too busy surviving." She stood there for a long moment, looking down at the grave, and then she spoke softly. "Thank you, Thomas, for bringing me to Nevada even if it was not for the right reasons. Thank you for being kind in your way. I am sorry I could not love you the way you deserved, and I am sorry your life was cut so short. But I am not sorry I survived. I'm not sorry I chose to live. I hope wherever you are, you understand that and you are at peace." Ryder squeezed her hand, and together they turned and walked away from the grave, from Verdi, from all the pain and judgment that had once threatened to destroy her. As they rode back toward the ranch, toward their children and their life and their future, Zelda felt a sense of completion she had not known she needed. "Thank you for that," she said to Ryder. "It was the right thing to do." "You deserved closure," he said simply. "You deserved to lay that ghost to rest on your own terms." The years continued to pass, bringing joys and sorrows in equal measure. They lost Mr. Sullivan to old age in 1902, mourned him as the father figure he had become. They celebrated weddings as their children found partners and started families of their own. They welcomed grandchildren with the same joy they had welcomed their own babies, watching the legacy they had built expand and flourish. In 1910, as they sat on the porch of the ranch house watching the sunset, both of them now silver-haired and weathered by decades of Nevada sun, Zelda turned to Ryder and took his hand. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "Choosing me, taking on all the trouble and scandal that came with me?" He looked at her as if she had grown a second head. "Regret loving you. Regret building this life with you. Zelda, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. You and our children and this ranch and every single moment we have shared. I would do it all again in a heartbeat, and I would fight anyone who tried to stop me." "We are getting old," she said, but she was smiling. "We are getting old together," he corrected. "And that is all I ever wanted. To grow old with the woman I love, surrounded by the family we created and the life we fought for." "I love you, Ryder Everett," she said, the words as true now as they had been 32 years ago. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Zelda Everett. My beautiful, brave, extraordinary wife. Thank you for choosing to live. Thank you for choosing me." They sat together as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, as the stars began to emerge in their familiar patterns, as the sounds of their grandchildren playing drifted from inside the house. And Zelda thought about the town that had said she should have died with her husband, about the cowboy who had said she was meant to live, and about all the years of love and laughter and struggle and triumph that had followed that single moment of choice. She had been meant to live. And she had lived fully, completely, without apology or regret. She had loved and been loved in return. She had built something lasting from the ashes of grief and loss. And that, she thought, was the greatest victory of all. Years later, in 1920, when Zelda was 65 and Ryder was 67, they sat in the same spot on the porch, watching their great-grandchildren play in the yard. The ranch had grown beyond their wildest dreams, now run primarily by their sons and grandsons, a thriving operation that employed dozens and supported multiple families. "We did good," Ryder said, his voice rough with age but still warm with love. "We did very good," Zelda agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder. The Double Bar Ranch continued to prosper for generations, a testament to the choice two broken people had made to love each other despite what the world said they should do. And though the town of Verdi never apologized for how it had treated the young widow all those years ago, Zelda found she no longer cared. She had lived, truly lived, and that was its own perfect revenge. On a warm summer night in 1925, Zelda passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 70, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, with Ryder holding her hand. He followed her 6 months later, unable to imagine a world without her in it, and they were buried together on a hill overlooking the ranch with a simple stone that read, "Ryder and Zelda Everett. They chose to live. They chose to love. They chose each other." Their descendants continued to run the Double Bar Ranch well into the 20th century, passing down the story of their great-great-grandparents who had defied a town's judgment and built something beautiful from grief and determination and love. And whenever someone asked what the secret was to the ranch's success, to the family's happiness, the answer was always the same: choose life, choose love, and never let anyone tell you what you are meant to do with your one precious existence. The legacy of the widow who refused to die, and the cowboy who believed she was meant to live, continued to inspire generations. A reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply keep breathing, keep fighting, keep choosing hope even when the world insists on despair. And that when you find someone who sees you, really sees you, and loves you not despite your scars but because of your strength, you hold on to them with everything you have and build something worth remembering.